All right, so I've discussed with you 6, and so now we're going to go up to 7. And remember, 7 is one of those like upper level scores. So 6 was, let me change this quick. 6 is like into the first score into upper level. 7 is now beyond that. So it's more than satisfactory. 7 is kind of like that in between, like really good and okay. Like it gets the job done, average. So this is definitely getting closer to what they would consider an excellent paper written in that 40-minute time period. But if you take a look here, 7 is a thinner version of an excellent paper. Okay, so it's impressive. Okay, it's cogent, meaning like it makes sense. It is a unified topic, or it's a unified argument. It's convincing, but it's less less well handled in terms of perhaps organization. I don't know why this is so dumb. Ugh, whatever. Less in terms of organization, so like this might be so like there might be a little bing bang bongo-ish. The thesis might not be as strong. Things are not, sometimes it perhaps gets off topic. It might be less handled in terms of insight. So in this case, they would be discussing the concept of like perhaps they address a little bit of the social progress that disobedience causes, but they don't really go into depth with it, or perhaps the vocabulary. Now, one thing I will point out is that like vocabulary is kind of a big thing. And what I mean by when I say big thing is like they're looking for students that have a good handle of language. And that's one of the reasons why I keep harping on you about strong verbs, because like if you use a strong verb, that will automatically, I'm telling you this as a reader, like that immediately bumps you up in terms of use of language. So rather than saying he is disobedient, you can say his disobedience creates blank, something like that. So, and I know this is just like vaguely talking about this, but what I'm trying to point out here is that vocabulary is kind of a big deal in terms of don't use the biggest vocabulary you can, but just use accurate and thoughtful, mature vocabulary. But definitely, if something seems kind of like, yeah, it's okay, but it's less mature, but look at the use of vocabulary, that'll push it up to a 7. Okay, that is almost always the thing that happens with a 7, is that it gets pushed up from a 6 because of the use of language. Again, this doesn't mean that you use all of the words that you've ever heard of. You use the biggest words you possibly can. That's not what that means. It simply means that you use appropriate and mature vocabulary. So if we continue, descriptors that come to mind while reading a 7, include clear understanding. So they understand what's being asked of them. It's less precise. They have an idea, but perhaps it's not as well developed, less well supported. So perhaps they've got evidence, but the evidence is not as strong as it could be. It's maturing. So what it means is like, while the 6 is less mature in thought, the 7 is leaning in that way of being mature. This writer has potential but hasn't quite got it all. So like if I were to read a paper and say, yeah, it's pretty good, but that's a 7, okay? So if you take a look at the argument prompt specifically, it says organization is mostly purposeful, but sometimes loses track. So there's a general purpose of the organization, but it sometimes veers off track. Evidence is purposeful, but sometimes too obvious, right? So they might provide more evidence than they need. And it says too obvious, but it could also be like evidence is purposeful, but also potentially not as clear, right? So like the evidence used is not just random, like the first thing that came to their mind. The evidence used is purposeful, but they don't handle it as well as they could. Warrant is mostly clear. Sometimes it states the obvious, or it's a little too blunt. So that would be like, and that is social progress, right? Or answers the prompt, but somewhat hints at the larger purpose. So let's take a look at what a 7 looks like, shall we? That would be right here. There we go. Okay, so you should be on page 175. It is the letter that you should see up in the corner is B. All right, so let's take a look as to why this is a 7. Okay, there's no such thing as a perfect society. Mankind has always had a few individuals among the masses who stood for change. So already I'm seeing relating to the prompt, this individual likely faced hardships as a result because people do not generally like change. Most people prefer to do what they are most comfortable with or what is expected. These people may be considered, quote, ideal citizens. However, change cannot be achieved without disobedience. So the first thing I want to point out is that this student, unlike some of the other students, the other papers that we've read, this student has constructed an idea in the introduction, right? So this concept of like, do you want change? If so, you need to be disobedient. If you're okay with how things are, you're not going to rock the boat or anything. So this student is making it very clear that change seems to only happen with disobedience. So they're developing this idea, and they're doing so pretty much in a pretty decent way. They're not just saying change requires disobedience. They're developing this idea. Let's continue with their intro. Disobedience is not simply the refusal to listen. It can also be interpreted as the refusal to abide by social expectations of society. So, like, they're developing a more nuanced idea. So, like, it's not just not doing what people tell you to do, it's also not doing what people would expect you to do, okay? Continuing, certain individuals, events, and works in history illustrate the revisiting, is that revisiting? Oh, necessity, sorry. And works in history illustrate the necessity of change as a result of disobedience. And so here's one thing that I'd like to point out as to like word choice that's pretty good. Certain individuals, events, and works in history illustrate the necessity of change as a result of disobedience. Now notice, this is good word choice, but it's nothing spectacular, meaning like it's not the biggest words you've ever seen. It simply articulates an idea in a concise and clear manner. They don't just say like certain individuals, events, and works in history show the importance of blank, blank, blank. Illustrate the necessity it's just a stronger way of saying this. So, okay. So this student says like, yep, we need we need disobedience for change. Examples include Rosa Parks, those who went against the rule of the British king during colonial times, and events described in the novel The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. So this student provides a more direct thesis. I don't know if you need that. Right? So like this would be an example of like they've developed a really good thesis here, and then they say, let me tell you all of my evidence, which is not really a great form of a thesis. So you're like, this would be an example of say, yeah, they're good, but let's see how this person develops their idea. Rosa Parks remains one of the most influential faces of the Black civil rights movement. Her most famous act of disobedience was refusing to give up her seat on the bus to a white person. During times of segregation, which is when this took place, this was deemed highly disrespectful and punishable by law. Look at how nice that sentence is. During times of segregation, which is when this took place, this was deemed highly disrespectful and punishable by law. Again, not super intense language, but just appropriate language. So, they're giving me necessary background. Okay, let's continue. This act of hers may seem minuscule at first, but the results were very significant. As a matter of fact, her actions were a part of a much larger resistance organized by the NAACP in efforts to challenge the judicial system. Now, look at this. This student is not only using strong word choice, but also they know stuff. So just like I said in class, the test is biased in favor of people who know stuff, right? So this person knows more. It's not just Rosa Parks sat on a bench or sat on a bus and said, "No." This is Rosa Parks who worked as a larger resistance, as the student says, to challenge the judicial system. Like, this student knows stuff. Okay, so the student is conveying this, and all of this information is necessary to show me, like, they don't just talk about Rosa Parks, they talk about Rosa Parks and this larger idea of resistance. So now what the student is doing is they're almost using, like, they're using this logic, inductive logic to say, like, Rosa Parks did this, larger groups did this. Let's see what they come to the conclusion of. This is the most effective way to attain civil rights. Knowing the consequences of her disobedience, Rosa Parks disobeyed the laws of society. She knew that the most important result was change, which is what the black community needed. Without her efforts and others like her, the civil rights movement might never have existed. So, here they're starting to get to that social progress aspect. That talking about the importance of disobedience. Now, the one thing I would say is that I think the student could clarify a little bit more or talk more specifically about what social progress was made. They just say this general, like, her efforts, the civil rights movement would have never existed. Like, what are they trying to get? What progress resulted from this? So they just say, like, oh, she was disobedient, which made sure that the civil rights movement happened. So this is a time where on the rubric where it says like they have warrant is mostly clear, but they could probably develop it a little bit more. Okay, so let's take a look again at the next couple paragraphs. I'll try to do this briefly so this isn't the longest video known to man. Okay, another example of disobedience that brought about change was the Revolutionary War. The colonists were tired of the British oppression and greed. As a result of the England's title and most powerful nation, many colonists were likely afraid to speak against the will of the English king. This is interesting. So acknowledging like there's not really a desire to speak against them because out of fear. Fortunately, there were some who were willing to go against the regime and transform the colonies into something extraordinary. Okay, so this is a vague reference. This amount of increasing tension led to the Revolutionary War. The independence of the colonies and the establishment of the United States as a country was arguably the most important result of any British conflict. So here, they're being more direct in terms of what progress was made. A whole new country was created. Many other countries, such as France and Spain, were no longer afraid to challenge England. The United States has also brought about many significant improvements of foreign relations and economy of many countries. The United States would not be possible if not for the disobedience of the British king. So that's a little confusing. And the raging fire of rebellion in the spirit of the Revolutionary War's army. So, look what this student did in terms of creating an understanding of social progress. It wasn't just the fact like, yay, the United States is here, but yay, the United States separated themselves, created a country, allowed other countries to say, we too can fight against a ruling country, and then even the effects of today. So this student is doing a really good job of articulating more concretely what progress was being made. So they don't just say like, yay, United States is great. They say, yay, United States is great, and look at this long-lasting impact that the Revolutionary War had. So this is a much stronger example. Again, student knows stuff by knowing that it's because of the revolution in America that definitely France had. I'm less familiar with what was going on in Spain. However, like this student they know their history. And then, next paragraph, Ayn Rand's novel The Fountainhead had many themes. The most important was individuality. Disobedience expands to independence in that one is required to disconnect himself from others in order to achieve independence. This disconnection often required disobedience. So they're talking about like social expectations, right? So they're using this work of fiction and they're acknowledging like the social expectations in that text. This disconnection often required disobedience. In the novel, the social structure of collectivism and second-handedness is challenged. One of the many speeches made by the character Howard Rourke establishes that defiance through individualism is the key to progress in society. So again, providing specific evidence. He was an architect who specialized in modern styles. In a time when old Renaissance style was preferred, he faced great difficulty. Society failed to realize that the changing times also required changes in the architecture. Those people were not courageous enough to be disobedient. Those who were courageous enough eventually became leaders that lead society into periods of change and innovation. Eventually, the public began to realize that modern architecture was the best option of society, as goes as time goes on, the world must learn to evolve with the changing times. And so, like, the thing about this one is that, like, the idea that's being used here is really, really good. So, like, but they kind of get off into a tangent a little bit. Like this, look at how big this paragraph is concerning Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. So like they provide some detail in here that might be unnecessary. So like the stuff down here about like changing with the times, etc., and the use of architecture. So like, is architecture social progress? That's a little unclear. I mean, the idea is good, but the way that the idea of the Ayn Rand text, The Fountainhead, is a good idea, but they kind of fall flat in how it's actually executed with this text. But let's continue. Those who do not adapt to change will survive. Similarly, those who remain stagnant and oppressed, always living the easiest life, will not survive. Wow, that's a pretty strong statement, and not a bad one. They're making it very clear what their position is. Disobedience is difficult to accomplish successfully, but it is an inherent trait of man. So, this is actually really, really good, because throughout the text, they do point out, like, disobedience, it's important, but it's not easy. They do this by talking about Rosa Parks, and she acknowledged that she was going to be punished by law, but she continued to do it. Acknowledged that with the British or the American Revolution, that they acknowledged that this would be difficult to do because this was the most powerful nation, but they did it anyways. And then even in the Ayn Rand, they talk about the social expectations and how they said bluntly that he faced great difficulty. So what this student is doing is they're actually acknowledging, like, yeah, disobedience is important, but it's not easy. So like this student is expressing that maturity. Okay, so it's impressive. They've got a cogent idea. They are definitely mature in what they're doing. They can develop it more, but it's maturing. Okay, yep, right here. Change is necessary in order to endure. Social progress is a direct result of social disobedience. In order to change a system, one must first challenge the system. It's a nice, strong ending there. But so this is a good example of a 7. So this is where you're getting up into the upper level of the essays.